This hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Our hearing today is on anti-NGO laws and other tools of democratic repression. And we thank our witnesses for being here to share their expertise and knowledge and to help us deal with this extremely important subject, a trend that we've seen growing that is adding to the concerns of the backsliding of democratic states. The use of defamation laws, foreign agent registration laws, and anti-NGO laws to silence free speech is nothing new. We see it in Russia, in Nicaragua, and Uganda, whose leaders have long used these tools to target journalists, judges, civil society activists, and opposition political figures to consolidate power and silence dissenting voices and views. Ethiopia shuttered over 1,500 civil society organizations for failing to submit their annual reports. Uganda's horrific new law targeting LGBTQI+ individuals has resulted in mass evictions, violence, and arrests. India, over the years, has weaponized its Foreign Contribution Regulation Act to suspend several American and international NGOs' operations in the country, including respected human rights organizations like Amnesty International. And Hungary launched an investigation into Transparency International, a non-governmental organization that takes on corruption worldwide. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing is an expert at using so-called legal mechanisms to silence citizens and critics alike. Nowhere has this been more on display than what has occurred in Hong Kong in recent years, as the passage of the National Security Law and entry into force of Article 23 destroyed what remains of Hong Kong's democracy. But in recent years, we have also seen more and more nations that would consider mostly democratic or partially free turning to these laws as tools of repression. It is deeply concerning that democracies from Georgia to India to Turkey have used their legal systems against journalists, opposition politicians, human rights defenders, and civil societies. So I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today to discuss this important topic. You have all done impressive work in this space. I want to acknowledge that many of these laws are totally legitimate. There are reasons to register foreign agents, to protect individuals from defamatory attacks, to require NGOs to pay fees or taxes on time, to use Interpol red notices to track down fugitives and criminals. And you might hear some of these actors claim we're not anti-civil society. Don't you have a registration of the 501c3 laws in the United States? Yes, but of course the problem is when these laws are turned into tools of repression and intimidation. Those in power know the effects of these tactics. They have led to draw in expensive procedures. The heavy financial and psychological cost of these legal measures on their targets creates a chilling effect, silencing government critics and stifling democratic dissent. That is why, as chairman of this committee, I've made a concerted effort to counter these trends. The Human Rights Defenders Act, which I introduced this year, the Transnational Repression, Accountability, and Prevention Act, which was enacted last year, the International Freedom Protection Act, which the committee has reported out, and of course, the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. Since the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program went into effect in 2017, the United States has sanctioned over 650 foreign persons and entities. Congress, acting on a bipartisan basis, has made huge impacts in supporting and defending human rights. The United States and the international community have certainly taken important steps to address these challenges. I'm very supportive of programs like Reporters Shield, Journalists in Distress Network, Scholars at Risk, and the Lifeline Embattled CSO Assistance Funds. These are all critically important. But we need to do more, and time is of the essence. For so many years, the Republic of Georgia has been a bright spot in the former Soviet Union. But just this April, despite massive street demonstrations, the government passed a foreign influence registration law that goes into effect this fall. Amazingly, this law is modeled after a Russian law. Considering what Russia has done to Georgia, that is unbelievable that they would follow that path, that allows the government to target nonprofits and activists. It intends to intimidate and ultimately force the closure of civil society voices that are out of step with the government. The sponsors of the law and the governing Georgia Dream political party have been very clear about their intentions and about which civil society actors they perceive as enemies. The poster behind me shows a bank of posters hung in front of one of our witnesses' home, Gigauri. She has to face that every morning when she walks out of her house. Similar posters have been placed in front of Transparency International offices. These posters say, "Our homeland is not for sale," calling in question the loyalty of the people that are advocating against these repressive laws. A statement intended to impugn and label NGO leaders as foreign agents. Congress, and this committee in particular, has a responsibility to take bold legislative action to confront the use of these laws head on and to support the bold activists that are determined to hold on to democracy. Today in my office, I'm releasing a video showcasing the incredible stories and work of human rights defenders, courageous people from Uganda, Venezuela, Burma, and Colombia who are speaking out in order to hold their governments accountable. I encourage you to visit the Senate Foreign Relations Committee website and our Twitter account at SFRC_Dems to watch the video. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work to protect the essential elements of liberal democracies: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, media freedom, and religious freedom. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses their assessment of our efforts in this regard so far, and suggestions on how we can be more effective in the years to come. It's now my pleasure to turn to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch, for his opening comments.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for that, and certainly your work in this field is to be recognized and appreciated. First and foremost, I think we should all agree and recognize this is not a partisan issue. This is a bipartisan issue, and it's an American issue and something we all need to work on together. Unfortunately, it's a fact that autocrats and their governments will do whatever it takes to stay in power. They survive and in some cases re-emerge using creative methods to repress their political opposition and silence human rights advocates and others who seek to shine a light on their actions. The tool of choice for authoritarians these days is anti-non-governmental organization laws, also referred to as foreign agent laws. These laws claim to stop foreign influence, but in reality are used to close the space for civil society and opposition. Autocrats fear the loss of control, and this ensures opposing ideas are neither seen nor heard. It should not surprise anyone that the model anti-NGO law was first designed by Vladimir Putin. Russia's anti-NGO law has been used as a model since then across the world in repressive places. In nations like Azerbaijan and Belarus, dictators have used lawfare to consolidate control and close the space that once existed for small amounts of free speech. Laws that criminalize government watchdogs and champions of democracy are used to crush dissent and shield corrupt officials from scrutiny. In places like Sudan and Syria, both formal and informal restrictions are used by malign actors to control what, when, where, and to whom life-saving aid can be delivered. This weaponization of restrictions against legitimate NGOs undermines U.S. values and interests. I'm particularly concerned about our friends in Georgia. Despite clear statements from the EU that passing laws to restrict NGO activities will halt EU membership, Georgia's government has persisted. I'm glad the U.S. has undertaken a review of our policies towards Georgia and am supportive of the current pause in assistance. Senator Shaheen and I were pleased to go to Georgia in 2012 as we watched the first real free and fair election. I think both of us were very pleased at what happened and the way it was initially received. Since then, our confidence and our view, at least mine, and I think having conversations with Senator Shaheen, have been disappointed, and I think that's probably an understatement, at the movement back towards what the Georgian people had been blessed with, and that was freedom from the Russian bear. So we hope, as we go forward, that things turn around in Georgia. Hungary has also made several attempts to advance anti-NGO legislation, and Slovakia has an active proposal that would require NGOs that receive funding from abroad to label themselves organizations with foreign support. The EU has warned that it will take legal action and launch infringement procedures against Slovakia if it does so. In China, it's no surprise the government views foreign NGOs as threats to its national security. Its anti-NGO law drastically reduced the ability of both foreign and domestic civil society actors to work in China. China is locking up human rights advocates and torturing them, and it is pursuing them abroad through transnational repression. We must remember these victims and advocate for them. I am submitting a list of their names for the record. Beijing's actions do not occur in a vacuum. When it prosecutes human rights advocates, other authoritarian actors take note. In 2020, Beijing unilaterally imposed a national security law on Hong Kong, ending the city's fragile autonomy. Since then, the Hong Kong government has weaponized this law and other colonial-era laws to criminalize political dissent. I think we're all aware of the terrible case of Jimmy Lai. His trial has been delayed repeatedly and is a mockery of the rule of law. Hundreds of other political prisoners have been jailed alongside Mr. Lai in Hong Kong, and the government has even pursued dissidents who fled by issuing extraterritorial arrest warrants. In Africa, many governments use anti-NGO laws to restrict civil society activities, limit funding from international donors, and control the operations of local and international partners, including USAID. This is happening in countries like Tunisia, Tanzania, Sudan, Chad, Zimbabwe, and Rwanda. These examples I've cited are just a few of the many that occur all around the world. This problem is only growing as technology changes and those in power find new ways to hold on to control. The United States must do more to combat this trend. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today what they are doing and what more can be done on this important issue. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me thank Senator Risch for his opening comments, and as you pointed out in the beginning, I could have given your opening statement, you could have given my opening statement, because I think we both agree on the challenges that we have to democratic states and other oppressive states on the use of these tools. So today we are honored to have three distinguished witnesses. I'm going to introduce each of you. Your full statements will be made part of the record. We'll ask that you proceed to try to summarize your comments in about 5 minutes, leaving time for questions. We are honored to welcome Mr. Douglas Rutzen, the President and CEO of the International Center for Nonprofit Law, where he has worked to improve the legal environment for civil societies and public participation worldwide. Mr. Rutzen also serves on the OECD Civic Space Observatory Advisory Group and previously served on the advisory board of the UN Democracy Fund. He has also served on the USAID Administrators Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid and co-chaired the State Department's Global Philanthropy Working Group. I'm also honored to welcome Ms. Iga Gigauri, a Georgian public figure and civil activist who has been the Executive Director of Transparency International Georgia since 2010, one of the leading organizations in the fight against corruption. She has bravely led efforts to counter Georgia's anti-civil society legislation. She's also deep government experience, firmly serving as the deputy head of the Border Police of Georgia, where she successfully moved forward anti-corruption reforms and within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And lastly, I'm pleased to welcome Yaqiu Wang, the Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. Ms. Wang has an extensive history of working on human rights issues in the region, previously served as a senior China researcher at Human Rights Watch. She's also worked on press freedom issues with the Committee to Protect Journalists, focusing on China and other Asian countries. With that, we will start with Mr. Rutzen.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to testify today. First, the data. In the last 5 years, 72 countries have introduced 270 measures restricting civil society. Governments are converting the rule of law into the rule by law to control civil society and constrain civic freedom. Disaggregating the data, 33% of the measures restrict the ability to form or operate a nonprofit. Last month in Venezuela, the government passed a new law that would give Maduro's regime unbridled discretion to determine which nonprofits can exist. At the same time, as Chairman Cardin referenced, Nicaragua closed down 1,500 nonprofits, including religious organizations, human rights groups, and the American Chamber of Commerce. And in Afghanistan, the government issued an order banning women from working in a nonprofit. So the first trend from the data, barriers to participate in civil society. Second, governments are restricting the ability of civil society to access resources. Consider Niger, where a nonprofit requires governmental approval to receive donations, even from local businesses or citizens. Other countries, including Egypt, require governmental approval to receive international philanthropy or bilateral assistance. We are also finding, as Chairman Cardin and Ranking Member Risch articulated, the rise of these anti-foreign influence laws, which are overbroad and intended to defund, delegitimize, and intimidate defenders of democracy. And this brings me to the third and final trend from the data. 50% of the restrictions sweep across society. Examples include the national security law in Hong Kong, Burma's counterterrorism law, and Belarus's law on extremism. Governments are using these laws to target defenders regardless of the sector they're in, whether they're in civil society, business, the media, or otherwise. They also couple this with other tools, including surveillance, harassment of the defenders and their families, imprisonment, or worse. As a result, we're seeing this holistic compression of civic space. Some say that the world is witnessing a democratic recession, but many countries have already entered a new phase, the Great Repression. But progress is possible thanks to courageous colleagues on the front lines in the defense of democracy. And how can this committee support those efforts? As detailed in my written testimony, there are 3 Ps: programs, personnel, and policy. First, programs. The US government should create a global program to serve as an early warning system and to preemptively address anti-NGO laws. In terms of mitigation programs, let's ramp up initiatives that help defenders operate in restrictive environments. A good example is the Surge and Sustains Fund, which helps defenders access the internet. And let's expand protection programs to cover the full range of defenders under threat. Second, personnel. Let's ensure there is sufficient personnel at both state and AID to address the defense of democracy, including transnational repression. Finally, policy. Senator Cardin, I thank you for your leadership in championing the Global Magnitsky Act. However, in recent years, there's been a slowdown in the use of sanctions. Perhaps the committee could exercise oversight authority to promote the more effective use of these authorities. Finally, as bills advance through the Senate, please help ensure that they safeguard civil society, not only internationally, but also here at home. In closing, thank you for organizing this hearing and inviting me to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your comments. We'll now go to Ms. Gigauri.
Thank you. Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished senators. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this hearing. I'm thankful for the long-standing bipartisan support towards Georgia by this committee. I'm here to share a local perspective on resisting anti-NGO laws in Georgia, as well as my personal experience of being targeted as a human rights defender. The introduction of anti-NGO laws in different parts of the world is an alarming and growing trend. Anti-NGO laws, first championed by Putin's regime in Russia, enabled a smooth shift towards a consolidated autocracy. In countries like Georgia, when such laws are introduced, autocrats amplify Russian anti-Western disinformation, cultivate social division, and undermine partnership with the US and the EU, all against the will of the majority of citizens. Prevailing in this struggle requires two key elements: unity among proactive citizens who have chosen freedom, valuing it enough to defend it, and consistently strong support from the international democratic community for the vibrant civil societies they help develop and grow. In Georgia, this means the United States speaking and acting with a legitimate moral authority assertively and convincingly, as it has done for nearly 3 decades, when it helped Georgians protect their sovereignty, independence, and democratic aspirations. This is not to suggest that America should do the job for citizens who choose freedom over authoritarian rule. A free country is never granted, even by the greatest allies. It is earned by its citizens, for whom America has always been an inspiration. The key point is that in places where the pro-democracy movements are strong and America's well-established partnerships are challenged by actors like Russia, as in Georgia, maintaining a high level of support in backing democratic aspirations of nations can tip the balance. In Georgia, the introduction of anti-NGO laws, commonly referred to as the Russian law, sparked massive resistance. Yet the authorities continue to push the red lines to establish a Russian-style system of governance. For every citizen of Georgia, the upcoming elections on October 26 are essentially a referendum on a clear choice between a democratic, prosperous European future and the misery of being a Russian satellite. If Georgian democracy is defeated, and the country pledged into the Russian orbit again, this would mean an evaporation of the chances for the further democratic development of any country eastwards and southwards from Georgia. Geopolitically, this would mean Russia once again marking its backyard, claiming Georgia as a part of its sphere of influence. As per Russian playbook, autocrat objectives are simple: silencing critical voices, closing civic space, and neutralizing free media. Anti-NGO legislation is a convenient tool for these goals, providing a facade of legality. In Georgia, the process proceeded in 3 phases. The first one was preparing the ground for legalizing repressions. In this phase, a massive coordinated smear campaign was launched against the civil society, USAID, and US-based democratic promoting organizations. Among others, my family members and I have been subject to verbal attack and intimidation by high-level public officials as well. Phase 2, passing the law despite the public opposition. So the law was passed, mirroring Russian disinformation. Authorities amplified coordinated disinformation, portraying civil society and their international supporters as a global war party, destabilizing Georgia. The government adopted an openly anti-American stance and announced a shift away from the strategic partnership with the West. The phase 3, enforcement of the law. Labeling NGOs, it includes labeling NGOs, members and activists as foreign agents, and term deeply stigmatized in Georgia due to its Soviet era connotations, imposing heavy fines and seizuring assets of those who refuse to register, requiring NGOs to disclose sensitive personal data, with refusal leading to the penalties and asset freezes. The situation in Georgia is dramatic, but I'm not here to seek sympathy. In Georgia, we are engaged in a generational and existential struggle, defending sovereignty, independence, and the dream of a future, democratic future. We are determined to stand our ground. We are not alone. American and European allies support the Georgian people by delivering clear message to autocrats, reassuring pro-democracy actors, sanctioning those who undermine democracy, and initiating the Megobari Act and the Georgian People's Act. This support is deeply appreciated by every Georgian who chooses freedom over oppression. Georgians understand that freedom is never granted, but always earned, as it has been throughout our history. With the support of America and its allies, we once built an emerging democracy that has been an inspiration in our part of the world. And I believe that with your help, we will prevail once again. Thank you. And I'm ready to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony and for your courage. Ms. Wang?
Chairman Cardin, Ranking Member Risch, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Chinese government's tactics to suppress political dissent. China's authoritarian regime poses one of the biggest threats to American democracy and security. It is in the fundamental interest of the United States to support Chinese people's fight for democracy. Globally, Freedom House has tracked 18 consecutive years of decline in rights and freedoms, driven by worsening repression in autocracies and also backsliding in democracies, as my co-panelists spoken about. China ranks among the least free countries in the world and has declined significantly since Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012. Following a multi-year crackdown, China's civil society now has been largely decimated. Increasingly, authorities in Beijing and Hong Kong are deploying national security laws to criminalize independent human rights activism and journalism. Numerous human rights activists in mainland China and Hong Kong are languishing in jail on bogus national security charges as we speak. These courageous individuals have made extraordinary sacrifices for standing up to the Chinese Communist Party. It is imperative that the US government stand by them. The CCP's long arm of repression also stretches abroad, including on US soil. China conducts the world's most sophisticated and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression. Beijing's tactics span the full spectrum, from harassment and assaults, to co-opting other countries to render exiles, to mobility controls, to cyber attacks and coercion by proxy. Last November, Chinese diplomats and hundreds of people belonging to pro-CCP diaspora groups organized demonstrations in San Francisco during President Xi's visit. The pro-Beijing groups harassed and intimidated, and in some cases violently assaulted Chinese, Hong Kong, and Tibetan activists who came to protest Xi. On American campuses, some Chinese students have reported that they were intimidated by fellow students for speaking critically of the Chinese government. Beijing's digital surveillance has also made organizing pro-democracy activities very difficult in the US in the first place. Chinese social media and messaging apps such as WeChat, which are heavily used among first-generation Chinese diaspora, are also heavily censored by the Chinese government. In recent years, the US government has stepped up its response to CCP influence operations. The Department of Justice has issued a number of indictments in cases linked to the CCP. The growing focus on the threat is a positive development. But US officials face the challenge of maintaining a targeted, proportionate, and rights-respecting approach while also intensifying their overall efforts. Walking this line will require thoughtful policies and careful execution. In this context, Freedom House urges Congress to continue to call public attention to political prisoners in China and Hong Kong, and urge their immediate and unconditional release. Meet regularly with their families and provide funding to support them and their lawyers. We also call on members of Congress to work together to pass legislations that support and protect activists and hold perpetrators of CCP abuses accountable. including establishing a limited visa category to provide at-risk human rights defenders with a multiple entry, multi-year non-immigrant visa, and providing relevant officials the necessary training to respond to transnational repression. Lastly, we call on the US government to impose targeted sanctions of Chinese tech companies complicit in human rights abuses. For example, companies that sell surveillance equipment in Xinjiang should face economic penalties. Congress should also hold hearings to better understand the censorship and surveillance mechanisms of Chinese social media messaging apps widely used in the United States, and pressure the companies to uphold users' rights to free expression and privacy. In late 2022, protests over deadly fire in northwest China grew into one of the most open challenges to the CCP since the 1989 Tiananmen democracy movement. These white paper protests brought out hundreds of thousands of people in China, as well as many in the diaspora, claiming their rights and demanding freedom. As Washington and Beijing engage more and more overtly in geopolitical competition, we should not lose sight of the passionate longing for freedom that the Chinese people still hold. We should support their aspirations at every opportunity. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And let me thank you for your testimony as well. We'll now have rounds of 5-minute questions from the members of the committee. I want to first start by inviting you all to always share information with us in regards to individuals or sectors that you believe we can be more aggressive in using our sanction regime. We take that information very seriously. In regards to individual sanctions, as I'm sure you all are aware, there is a standard that needs to be met, particularly in regards to dealing with the banking restrictions that are included in that, because it does deal with individual rights and we have protection in our system. But we will always take the information you supply us, and we are aggressive. And we do thank both this administration and previous administrations for using the sanction regimes that we have created here in Congress. We are the initiators of it, to use that to deal with the issues we're talking about today. But we can be better at that, and we welcome your input. One of the hats I wear is I've been a member of the Helsinki Commission since I've been in the United States Senate, and before in the House of Representatives. I've chaired the Helsinki Commission. One of the guiding principles of the OSCE is to protect the rights of NGOs. I mean, that's one of the basic foundations of the Helsinki principles. So when we see NGOs denied the opportunity to operate because of these repressive laws, that's contrary to the commitments that were made with the OSCE participating states. And China's not a member of that, but certainly that applies to Georgia. I also want to just start with a question, maybe start with Mr. Rutzen, if I might. You know, we've seen the use of traditional repressive tools, such as physical assaults, disappearances, and even murders of people who disagree with their governments. But now we see these countries using so-called legal means, passing laws, and as Mrs. Wang pointed out, using social media, the freedom of expression, the freedom of access to use that against and try to bring down our democratic systems of government. So tell me the calculations that are being made by what type of countries that are now trying to mask their repressive policies through the use of these methods rather than the direct attack. We see, for example, in Venezuela, Mr. Maduro is very clear about physical assaults and disappearances. What goes into that calculation, and how effective is it, and what can we do about it?
Thank you, Chairman Cardin, for that thoughtful question. What we're seeing in some sense is the rise of authoritarian legalism, where they realize that the law can not only protect rights, but it can just as easily undermine rights. And we see this throughout history. Think about the apartheid-era laws or the Nuremberg laws, how the laws can be used to undercut human rights. And so this has always been a tool in the authoritarian toolbox, but now it's being amplified and replicated around the world. You heard about the example of the Russian version of the foreign agents law, then spreading to Georgia, but now a number of other countries as well. And I think what we're seeing is that for many governments in their calculations, they think that they have some patina of political legitimacy if they can wrap their restrictions under the cover of law. And that's why we're seeing this rapid ascent of anti-NGO laws and other restrictions in democracy defenders around the world.
What impact is Russia having on these decision makings, for example, in Georgia? Is Russia, we know that they get engaged in the internal affairs of other countries. Are they actively encouraging these types of activities?
Yes, I would say that they prized our government when the government has initiated this law, and also when looking at their stories, what they were sharing in their internal audience. So you could see that, they were very glad that it's happening in Georgia. Just recently, Meta has deleted around 60 fake accounts which were ruled and managed from the territory of Russia, but they were attacking those who were participating in the demonstrations against this law and undermining their reputation. And at the same time, they were promoting the decisions of the Georgian government. So I think that definitely these two, I think that this is like really linked with the interest of Russia. And the interest of Russia is not to have democracy in Georgia. This is for sure.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. Gigauri, I've got a number of questions for you since we've been watching this since 2012 from afar and shaking our heads on it because we're seeing this backslide and we don't really understand it. I mean, you're a country of a little under 4 million people. And it seems like there's at least a significant movement toward embracing the Russian form of government and the Russian repression. We just don't understand it. I mean, you got your freedom from Russia, and why the country would be drifting back that way. We look at Georgia, and we compare it to the three Baltics. And, those are small countries, too. Two of them at 1.5 million and one at 2.5 million. And I'll tell you what, those people, they come to see us all the time. They are united. They are firm. They are afraid. They want our help. They don't want anything to do with Russia in any way, shape, or form. And yet, here you have Georgia, who were visited by an invasion from Russia, which took 2 of its territories and promised to leave and still aren't. They're occupying the territories. Why in the world is there, I mean, you're always going to get a handful of nuts, but why would you have these significant numbers of people who seem to want to drift back to the communist and socialist way of life that Russia had? Help us understand this.
Thank you for the question. So I think that in spite of this disinformation that we observe for years now, the majority of Georgian citizens support Georgia's integration in the EU and NATO. And these are the official numbers. So what happens is that we talked here about the particular laws, right? But before the laws are introduced, there is this very heavy disinformation campaign. And there you see the messages that were invented by the Russians in 2012. For instance, that these liberal groups are against the, the family values or the national interest of the country. That, all these people who are working for the NGO community, they hate everything national, right? So, I mean, that the NGOs are only promoting the LGBT rights and they care about the LGBT rights and all these kind of things. So this is very heavy. They are playing with the hearts and minds of Georgian people. At the same time, you always see in the pro-government and anti-West media in Georgia that, in the West, there are problems. There is destabilization. People live a terrible life there, like in Russia. That also there is also some trends which is against the family values, and they don't care about their families, their children. I mean, this is everything happening all the time for years, and then people are raising, so it's not that the government tells them that, the West is bad, but they, with this information, they try to persuade them to raise the question, so whether they want to go there or not. But again, this is a not big number of people. I would say that the majority still supports the...
I hope you're right. In today's world with the information available to us, there's always disinformation out there. And we in America believe that if you put everything on the table and all the facts are there, smart people, or even semi-smart people, will pretty quickly realize that democracy is a whole lot better than authoritarianism. So what you're talking about, we see here, that kind of disinformation, but its effect is pretty de minimis. Well, you give me hope when you tell me that the vast majority want to do the right thing. I will tell you that we will be watching the elections next month, and Senator Shaheen and I were greatly impressed with the elections that we saw. We weren't the only observers. Obviously, there were ones from all over the world, a lot of them from Europe, that were watching those elections. And I have to tell you, those elections were about as straight up as I've ever seen, and I've been in lots of elections. I've run 36 times myself, so I know what they're like. And I was impressed. I really was impressed with the way they were held. If what you say is true about the Georgian people and what they want, they're going to get an opportunity in October to throw the rascals out and take a hold of their own future. And we'll be watching closely, praying for you, and hope it works. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Cardin and Ranking Member Risch, for your strong comments, and thank you to each of you for being here and for the work that you do every day. Ms. Gigauri, it's nice to see you again. We had the opportunity to be part of a conversation early in August when Congressman Turner and I visited Georgia to try and address what was happening there and to make clear that we support the aspirations of the Georgian people, and to make that point to the government as well. I applaud you and all of the civil society community for your bravery in holding the Georgian government to account, and for your willingness to participate in trying to ensure that there is a free and fair election on October the 26th. In the meeting that we had with the Prime Minister, we raised the recent setback in U.S.-Georgia relations that are reflected by the passage of the Foreign Agents Law. And we urged him to think about ways in which we could address Georgia's relationship with the United States moving forward that would support the aspirations of the Georgian people and ensure a free and fair election. And I'm really sad to say that The only request that he had of us was that the United States stop funding NGOs, which are critical of the Georgian government. And as Congressman Turner explained, in a democracy, we all recognize that you can be critical if you disagree with the policies. Now, I understand that the Prime Minister has questioned our account of that meeting, but I wasn't the only person in the room. We all heard what he had to say, and I am further disappointed that the Georgian Dream Party has taken the position that they will not acknowledge opposition parties that disagree with them going forward. So, you know, as Senator Risch said, the United States has been a partner of Georgia for 30 years now, supporting its democracy, its self-determination, its security, and it's a relationship that has been based on shared values. And the fact that the Georgian Dream government is willing to throw that away to continue to curry favor with Russia is really hard to understand, especially given that 20% of the Georgian territory is still occupied by the country of Russia. But I wonder if you could give us a little update on what's happening with the Foreign Agents Law. My understanding is that very few civil society groups have registered because it's a very onerous, very difficult process. And so have you also seen the government go after those organizations, and are you anticipating that that will happen for those groups that don't register?
Thank you for the question. So in Georgia, many, as you have mentioned, many civil society organizations have not complied with the law. So we don't use this as it happened in many other countries, like the badge of honor. We think that this should not be used like this. We think that we are not the agents or spy undermining the interests of Georgia. We are the patriots of our country, and whatever we do, this is for the better future of our country and the people of our country. So that's why majority, I would say 95%, have not registered, and the government has several weeks now to start the monitoring, and then we expect the heavy fines like it is in the law. However, we are ready to resist. So many organizations who have not registered, they are also involved in monitoring of the elections. We have different backup plans. We are mobilizing, we are uniting our resources by saying this is the civic activist groups and the NGOs. So just recently we have created huge coalition of NGOs which will be monitoring the elections in Georgia. And we will make sure that the votes of Georgian voters will be safe, and we will defend their votes during the elections. This is for sure.
And do you think the majority of the Georgian people believe that that will happen, that it will be a free and fair election and that they will participate?
I think, of course, there are many questions about the fairness of the upcoming elections, because now even we already observe the abuse of administrative resources, attacks on the opposition, and yeah, definitely this law creates the obstacles for the observer organizations to monitor the elections, right? But I think at the same time, I think that for majority of Georgians, these are very crucial elections. And this is, as I said, the referendum between the membership of the EU and to become the country which is under the influence of Russia. So I think that many people will participate in the elections. They know that there might be some obstacles, but what we do at this moment is that we try to inform them how to vote, how to avoid the violations, how to react on the violations. And the most important thing here is how to believe in the victory, that they should participate in the elections because every vote matters. And I think that this is the common understanding amongst the Georgians now.
Well, thank you. That's an important message for us in the United States and for everywhere that there are elections between now and the end of the year. Senator Coons.
Thank you so much, Senator Shaheen, Ranking Member Risch. Thank you for your work together and with Chairman Cardin to promote democracy and free elections, to protect NGOs and civil society and those who are advocates for free speech, for freedom, for organizing, and for the rights of individuals around the world. As the founder and co-chair of the Human Rights Caucus in the Senate, I've been engaged in these issues a long time and gravely concerned to continue to hear about the steady loss of freedom around the world. Freedom House has been year after year documenting broader, deeper attacks on civil society, increased restrictions on your ability to receive funding and to operate, that I think all senators of both parties should be more engaged in and concerned about. And I'm grateful that this is a bipartisan hearing today. And as the chair of the committee that funds State Department and USAID, Mr. Rutzen, I take directly your suggestions that we need to provide more support for personnel, for operations, for outreach, to support the Human Rights Defenders Fund, to provide cybersecurity support for targeted individuals, to condition assistance in countries like Georgia, where there's legitimate concern about their drift towards authoritarianism. Ms. Gigauri, thank you for your testimony today and for your courage. I'm grateful that Senators Shaheen and Risch are leading on the Georgia legislation that I hope we will move forward soon. And I'd be interested in your view of what Russia's aggression in Ukraine does to send a broader signal. You said one of your core challenges is to convince people that free and fair elections are still possible, that free speech is still valuable. My concern is that when we fail to defend democracy and elections in our own country or in other countries, when there are acts of open aggression in the region, in Georgia, in Moldova, in Ukraine, that it sends a chilling signal that strong men and authoritarian regimes are on the march. What more can we do together to make sure that there is a broader global push to fight corruption and to promote democracy?
Thank you for the question. So the short answer is, for our part of the world, is to make Russia small and weak. And I really mean it. It is very difficult for a country to build a democracy if you are neighboring Russia. And it was extremely hard for us to do this, but still, years ago, we showed the good example to everyone that it's possible, even being neighbor of Russia, it's possible to build the state and to fight corruption and to implement democratic reforms in the country. I think that the war in Ukraine, of course, affected us. And I think that the whole international community should do everything to help Ukraine to win this war, and I'm sure they will do this. And this will have the impact on Georgia as well. In our case, this was trigger for our government to take all masks off. We would never expect the Georgian citizens that they would not support Ukraine, that they would be involved in the anti-Ukraine propaganda, and they will be attacking them. So this is something that was not acceptable for us, and at that time we had also the demonstrations in support of Ukraine and all this. I think that this is very important. The second one is, of course, sanctions. But please introduced the sanction regime which is targeting individuals, not the people of Georgia. Because people of Georgia, they fought for democracy and they proved that they are very effective in that. And the third one, I understand that many countries are unique, but it is very important to have early warning system. It is very important to cooperate and to listen to different pro-democratic groups on the ground to know where the situation is going. Because sometimes reactions on time might bring bigger results. So, so this is it. Yeah.
Thank you. If I might, Ms. Wang, you mentioned a special visa for human rights defenders and those who are civil society leaders who are under pressure. Mr. Rutzen, you mentioned the early warning system. Could the two of you briefly focus on what exactly you think we could do to strengthen and expand visa options for those who are under pressure, who are human rights activists or civil society activists, and what more we could or should do around an early warning system and how it could improve its function?
Thank you for the question. Freedom House has supported the pass of the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act. We think the provisions in the act are great, and we urge its passage. For example, the multi-year and the multi-entry visa for human rights defenders who are at risk inside the country is very important because oftentimes, police who came to your house to raid you or take you to the detention center, it comes very, very abruptly, right? And for Chinese citizens, you can't just come to the U.S., board on a plane. You can't do that. So our suggestions for the U.S. embassies in China to identify those human rights defenders first, and so they have the visa first. So when they have to leave, they can leave immediately. Also, when they are in the U.S., they can continue to work here before they can return safely safely to China. Thank you.
Mr. Rutzen.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Briefly, if we engage once the laws are already on the docket, it's very hard to do anything about them. And so what we need to do is identify a list of countries where we think there might be legal threats against defenders and put in place some preemptive and proactive support to courageous individuals in country. This is sort of the AID approach, a developmental approach where you invest early so you build resilience into the society and you prevent and you preempt these initiatives from arising. There will also be a category of countries where something's just going to spark and there's going to be a need for rapid response. So we need to complement the early warning system with a broader global rapid response system to address threats as they arise.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Helmy.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I just want to applaud the bipartisan leadership that was mentioned at the beginning of this issue. As an Egyptian American, as a Coptic American, these issues are incredibly important to me. They've had an impact on my family. And I just appreciate the leadership and the bipartisanship on this, and would mention, obviously, Chairman Cardin's long-lasting legacy on this issue. Mr. Rutzen, you briefly mentioned Egypt in your testimony and its anti-NGO policies, which discourage a free and open society. In your view, how can this Congress and future Congresses hold the current and future administration responsible to engage Egypt and hold it accountable for its poor track record of human and religious rights and freedom of liberties, particularly in relation to Copts and other religious minorities, while supporting its capacity to nurture a public forum for religious freedom and civil participation?
Thank you for your question, Senator Helmy. I think what is important is we have engagement with local Egyptian civil society and religious leaders to see where are some of the needs they have in terms of support and defense of their rights to advocate. The change will have to come from within, as we know. So our role is to help defend those defenders and help protect civic space. in a public forum, I probably wouldn't get into too many details, but if helpful, I'd be happy to meet with your staff in private to discuss some specific ideas.
Yeah, I'd welcome that with the team and me personally. It's a very important issue, and as I think this Congress takes up its aid for Egypt down the road, it's an important topic that should be deliberated. And staying in that vein, if I may, Mr. Rutzen, what strategy or framework would it be useful for us to examine and address this challenge within the scope of our strategy towards Egypt and its regional partners?
Thank you. Let me introduce one argument that often isn't on the table. I'm a human rights lawyer. I love human rights, but sometimes we've got to focus on other arguments as well. And one of the tools I think that's underutilized is trade agreements. It's really interesting. If we look around the world, countries warmly welcome foreign investment. And in fact, we hold companies that receive foreign direct investment as being these glorious multinational companies. We don't call some of our biggest companies foreign agents because they receive investments from other countries. But yet when it's civil society, we restrict the free flow of capital across borders. So one of the ideas I think that we might advance is looking more closely at existing trade agreements to see the extent it might help cover the free flow of resources and assets across borders, not only for the for-profit economy, but also the nonprofit sector.
Thank you, Mr. Rutzen. Ms. Wang, if I may, understanding the PRC's growing and pervasive state-sponsored surveillance regime, I'd welcome the opportunity to learn more about your view on the importance of considering a reformed sanctions regime on the PRC and its state-owned enterprises, and how we hold them accountable for their unfettered access to civil society and dissidents at home and abroad. In your view, do you believe the current U.S. policy overlooks key elements of the long-term strategy to hold the PRC accountable in the midst of its growing influence in the tech space and its growing global reach? Thank you.
I think the U.S. government is doing better, and there needs to be more actions and more forceful enforcement of existing laws in terms of surveillance. I mean, there are Chinese companies who are complicit in China's human rights violations in Xinjiang being sanctioned by the U.S. government, and some are on the entity list. And then there are U.S. companies who the U.S. government has banned them from selling equipment that can be used in human rights violations in China. So both sides are necessary, but we, as we all heard from the news, companies are very smart in evading and sanctions. So we needed to do more research and do, have more personnel in the U.S. government to crack down on companies who are evading sanctions and punish them for doing that. The other day I met a Uyghur activist, and she just presented me of a bag of dates, and there was two big Chinese characters there that says Xinjiang. Those products should be banned by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but they're everywhere in the U.S., if you go to a Chinese supermarket, I mean, I read Chinese and I can see, the word Xinjiang there. So why they're still there? So that means the law is not really being enforced.
Thank you. I close again by applauding and deep appreciation to this committee for its bipartisan work in this space, and once again recognize the chairman's long-lasting legacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Kaine?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your work and your testimony. Sometimes we think this challenge is really limited to the authoritarian nations of the world, but sadly we see in democracies with whom we ally a significant effort to crack down on NGOs, or at least make it harder for NGOs to do their work. And I want to just use the example of India. India has a law called the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act that was amended in 2010, has been amended again in 2020, that makes it very difficult for NGOs operating in India to receive donations from people around the world. Organizations like Amnesty International and others have had to dramatically limit or shutter operations in India because they do rely on fundraising. But India has chosen through this act to significantly restrict the ability of organizations to operate and receive foreign funding. The law allows the freezing of bank accounts, investigations, et cetera. And it's one thing, and it's an important thing, when human rights activists and NGOs feel intimidated and can't do their work. But the bottom line is the real victims are those who are the beneficiaries of the work. There's an organization called the Sambali Trust, which is based in Rajasthan, whose goal is to empower women in this part of the country, and particularly disempowered or oppressed women. Very much a service provision organization, very much focused on a mission that would seem not only anodyne, but completely desirable, and yet a constituent reached out to us because the Sambali U.S. was having a difficult time soliciting donations and then being able to transfer those donations to their purpose, which was empowering women in the Rajasthan part of India. These statutes, and they're similar around the world, but I just want to focus on this financing, are a form of harassment to choke off the work that's being done. And if you choke off the work that's being done, sometimes you are not only hurting the human rights promoters and those who work with the NGO, but you're really hurting those who could benefit from the work. And this is really important. The U.S. is involved in some parts of the world where, frankly, the governments are not that necessarily a reliable partner in providing services or development, but NGOs are. I was a missionary in Honduras. We want to do things in the Northern Triangle, but we've had the experience of we want to invest, but the government is really not the partner to invest with. But the NGO community often has very strong NGOs that are exactly the partners you can invest with. But if they are choked off from receiving funds, then you essentially disempower the important causes that they represent. So I'm really interested in this, and I do want to raise, India is a great ally of ours. We often say we are the oldest democracy in the world, and they're the largest democracy in the world. And others may contest us in those titles, but we view the U.S.-India relationship as a very important one. But when organizations on the ground who are doing good work find their financing sources restricted or cut off, we have to pay attention to that. And so I just wanted to put this one on the table and reference the Sambali U.S. and their challenges. I believe eventually we worked with them, State Department and others, and were able to work through the maze to enable them to again begin to forward donations to the important work that they do. But I think there's other NGOs, including some known very well by members of this committee, that still have not been able to find a way forward to offer the services they provide. So this is a global problem, not just with authoritarians. You used the phrase, Mr. Rutzen, sort of authoritarian legalism. It's a act of parliament. The other thing about these financial restriction laws is they pose a grave risk of bribery and abuse. Because if you're a government official and you say to this NGO, well, there's a whole lot of money in a bank account abroad that you could get if I give you approval, but I have the ability to turn you down and not allow those foreign funds to come to you, these laws often are an invitation to bribery and corruption. So I think this is something we need to be paying more attention to, and it's one of the reasons I was really glad this hearing was noticed today, and I encourage you in the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Appreciate those comments. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony here today and for your ongoing work. Ms. Gigauri, thank you for your ongoing efforts. I've been following the testimony on C-SPAN, and I want to salute you for your determination to keep civic space open in Georgia. And I applaud the efforts of my colleagues, Senator Shaheen, Senator Risch, and others with respect to legislation. So I just wanted to associate myself with those remarks. Ms. Wang, I wanted to ask you a couple questions about Hong Kong, because one area where you have anti-NGO laws and many other forms of repression against civil society has been Hong Kong. It's gone into overdrive. A number of years ago, I teamed up with former Senator Pat Toohey, and we passed partisan legislation entitled the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which provides the executive branch the authority to sanction individuals, and officials, whether in Hong Kong or in China, who are cracking down on that repression. And it's a tool that's been used, but clearly we need to either expand the use of that tool or look for other methods, because we know that in March of this year, the Hong Kong legislature passed a new ordinance known as Article 23 that greatly expands the definition of national security offenses as any offense that, quote, endangers national security under the law. So these very sweeping powers that then are abused by the governments. And they've cut Hong Kong's democratic institutions and eroded civil society. So my question is, in addition to the sort of targeted sanctions against individuals and officials, are there other tools that you think we should be using? Or also, do you just think we should be making greater use of those existing authorities with respect to sanctions, or both?
I think you can expand the list of the people should be subjected to sanctions. And sanctions do work, especially for officials in Hong Kong. They usually have foreign bank accounts, so it does make a difference. And also, it sends a message to people who are fighting for freedom. The U.S. government is taking actions. It inspires them to keep going. Also, I think there are new laws that should be enacted. That, as I mentioned, that Freedom House supports the passage of the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act, which will allow, will provide additional support and protection of activists. Then we are also endorsing the Transnational Policy Act, which will provide support to activists who are being subject to transnational repression in the U.S. Just recently, a group of Hong Kong activists, Chinese and Tibetan activists, were violently assaulted in San Francisco because they were protesting President Xi's visit. There were hundreds of pro-CCP groups that were there, harassing them, and I know that the U.S. government is investing this case, and I knew there are many more similar cases. So we do, urge the U.S. government to strengthen the investment in cracking down on transnational repression on the U.S. We also, urge the U.S. government to engage more with the Chinese diaspora community, because as a Chinese person living in the U.S., I do worry the spill effect of that kind of rooting out Chinese spies, rooting out CCP interference, the effect on the Chinese diaspora overall. So the U.S. government needs to do it in a very careful way, so not to have an adverse effect on the diaspora. So how to do that? I think it's very important to engage with the community, actually have a dialogue to build trust with them, rather than just go there and ask, do you know there are Chinese spies in the community? Go there and ask, what are your worries? What are your concerns? How can we help you? So there are a lot of details that need to be ironed out so the U.S. government can crack down on CCP interference in the right way.
I appreciate that, and I agree with all your suggestions. My time is almost out, so I'm going to ask if you could submit an answer for the record on the issue of China's export of surveillance technologies. We've seen this through Huawei. We've seen this through ZTE. We even see it deployed here in the United States. China's obviously using that surveillance technology for repressive reasons, for repressive purposes in China. But I'd like, in your written response, to comment a little bit more on what we can do to counter the use of those surveillance technologies in many other countries, authoritarian countries and democratic countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Let me thank all three of our witnesses, not just for your testimonies, but for what you do frontline on these issues. This is a challenge on how we are going to be able to protect our democratic institutions, but to make it clear that they cannot be utilized to undermine the rule of law in our democracies. And we have foreign actors that are interfering in our own country, and then we have backsliding regimes that are using the so-called legal procedures to move their country away from democracy and the protection of human rights. So we have to be more strategic on how we go about this. And I appreciate, Ms. Wang, your support of the legislation that we have authored. I think Congress can do more in this area. I think we can do more in enforcement on our sanctions. I think there are areas that and I think we can do more in our priorities and our foreign policies and in the relationships, bilateral, multilateral relations we have with other countries, to make it clear we will not tolerate the type of action we've seen in Georgia. We've made that pretty clear. I think they understand that, and we're going to make it even clearer when we're going to pass legislation that Senator Risch has authored with Senator Shaheen. So we're going to take steps. We're going to be actively engaged, and that's one of the reasons we look forward to this hearing. The record of the committee will remain open through the close of business on Friday. If there's questions submitted by members, we'd ask that you would try to reply to those questions as quickly as possible. And Senator Risch, anything further?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, the committee will stand adjourned. Thank you very much.
How come it's